The morning Louisa Garrison's roof caved in was the same morning she decided, with absolute certainty, that she would not ask a single living soul for help. It happened just before dawn, when the weight of 3 days of hard rain finally broke the rotted center beam above her kitchen, sending a cascade of sodden timber and old shingles crashing down onto the iron stove her late husband had hauled all the way from Kansas City. The noise brought her bolt upright from the narrow bed in the back room, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. She stood in the doorway between the bedroom and the kitchen for a long moment, the cold morning air pouring through the jagged hole where her ceiling used to be, and looked at what was left of everything she had worked to hold together for the past 2 years. Louisa was 26 years old. She had been a widow for 22 months. She had a daughter named Clara who was 4, a son named Henry who was 6, 2 milk cows, a small vegetable plot, and $16.43 hidden in a tobacco tin beneath the floorboard beside the hearth. She had no neighbors close enough to hear her if she shouted, and the nearest town, Harlow Creek, was 4 miles east along a road that turned to mud soup when it rained. She looked at the collapsed roof for exactly 10 seconds. Then she pulled on her boots, tied her hair back, and went awake the children so she could move them to the back room away from the mess. This was the Kansas frontier in the spring of 1879, and Louisa Garrison had learned, the hard way and the slow way, that the land did not care about fairness. Her husband, Thomas Garrison, had died of a fever in the summer of 1877, leaving her with the homestead claim, the 2 children, and a debt to the Harlow Creek Mercantile that had taken her the better part of a year to pay off. She had paid it, every cent, by selling eggs and butter, and the 3 heifers that Thomas had purchased before he got sick. She had replanted the vegetable garden herself in the spring, had repaired the fence along the north pasture herself, had negotiated with old Amos Teller at the feed store herself, and had done all of it without accepting so much as a borrowed hammer from any of the church women who came calling with their sympathetic eyes and their covered dishes in the weeks after Thomas was buried. It was not that Louisa was cruel or ungrateful. It was something older and fiercer than that. Her mother had raised her on the belief that a woman who accepted charity became the kind of woman people pitied, and a pitied woman was a woman who had given up the right to be taken seriously. Louisa had watched her own mother hold a family together through 3 brutal Missouri winters on nothing but stubbornness and skill, and she had inherited both in full measure. So when the roof came down, she did not go to town. She assessed the damage herself, calculated that she could probably shore up the kitchen with the spare timber stacked behind the barn, and spent the morning moving the stove and the kitchen table into the yard where at least they would not be in danger. By mid-morning the rain had stopped, and the Kansas sky had gone the pale, washed blue of old denim, and the air smelled of mud and new grass and something faintly sweet she could not name. She had the smaller children settled with a cold breakfast of cornbread and milk when she heard the horse. She heard it before she saw it, the slow, deliberate clopping of an iron-shod animal picking its way carefully along the waterlogged road. Louisa straightened up from where she had been crouching beside Henry, who was more interested in whether the chickens were all right than in eating his cornbread, and shaded her eyes against the mid-morning light. The rider came around the bend in the road at an unhurried pace, the kind of pace that suggested the horse was sensible, and the rider even more so. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate only when they remembered to. He wore a dark coat that had been good once and was merely decent now, and a hat that had been rained on so many times it had developed a character all its own. He had a bedroll tied behind the saddle, and a rifle in the scabbard at the horse's shoulder, and the look of a man who had been on the road long enough that he had stopped noticing it. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and he slowed the horse further, which she noted. A man who slowed down when he saw a lone woman on a homestead with a collapsed roof showing through the yard was either cautious or polite. Either quality was preferable to the alternative. He stopped at the edge of her yard, keeping a respectful distance, and touched the brim of his ruined hat. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even, like water moving over smooth stone. "Morning," Louisa replied, and did not move toward him. He looked at the debris in her yard, at the stove sitting incongruously in the mud beside the upended kitchen table, at the gaping hole in the roof line visible above the front wall of the house. He did not make a remark about it. She appreciated that more than she could have said. "I am looking for the Harlow Creek Road," he said. "I came south from the Cimarron Crossing and I think I drifted a little west." "You drifted a lot west," she said. "Harlow Creek Road is about 1.5 miles east of here. You will hit it if you follow my fence line to the corner post and then cut right." He nodded once slowly. "Obliged." He did not leave immediately, which she had expected. Instead, he was looking at the timber stacked behind the barn, which she had not expected. His eyes moved from the timber to the collapsed roof to the timber again, and something shifted in his expression that she could not quite read. "Do you have a spare axe?" he asked. "I have my axe," she said. "It is not spare." "I mean, would you lend it to me for an hour? I can see you have got timber cut. I could square up that center beam for you before I head on. I do not need anything for it." There it was. The offer she had been dreading since she woke up that morning. She looked at him steadily. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a little more. He had gray eyes, honest and direct, and a jaw that needed shaving, and hands on the saddle horn that were scarred and competent in the way of hands that had done real work for a real long time. "I do not need help," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the roof again, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was not arguing with her but simply observing a fact. "All right," he said. He started to turn the horse. She watched him go. She watched him ride 3 steps, 4 steps, and then she looked at the roof and at the timber and at Henry, who had finished his cornbread and was now sitting on the fence post watching the stranger with the wide, uncomplicated admiration that 6-year-old boys reserved for horses and tall men. She hated what she was about to say before she said it. "Wait." He stopped the horse. "I will make a trade with you," she said. "You help me with the beam. I will feed you a proper hot meal and give you grain for your horse. That is a fair exchange." He turned the horse back around, and she saw something cross his face that might have been a smile but was controlled before it got all the way there. "That is more than fair," he said. "Then we have a trade," she said. "Not charity, a trade." "Understood," he said, and swung down from the horse with the easy motion of a man who had been climbing in and out of saddles his whole life. His name was Grant Wallace. He told her this when he tied his horse to the fence rail and came forward to shake her hand, which she offered, because she was not rude and because a handshake on a trade was a proper thing. His grip was firm and brief. "Louisa Garrison," she said. "You are doing this alone," he said. It was not a question and it was not an accusation. It was simply what he observed. "I am doing it," she said. "The alone part is not the point." "No," he agreed. "I suppose it is not." They stood there for a moment in the pale spring sunshine, with the mud drying around their boots and the children watching from the fence. And Louisa felt something she had not felt in 22 months, which was the specific discomfort of being seen by someone who was not sorry for what they saw. Grant Wallace went to work without further conversation, which she respected enormously. He examined the collapsed beam with the methodical attention of a man who understood structural problems, pulled the fallen timber clear in 3 efficient trips, and then assessed the span of the opening with a carpenter's eye that told her he had done this kind of work before and was not simply making it up as he went along. "You have got a good piece of oak in that stack back there," he told her, coming back to where she was sorting through the debris. "It is already roughly the right length. It will need to be squared at the ends and notched to sit in the wall plates. Have you got a chisel?" "I have got a chisel," she said. "Then this will take maybe 2 hours and it will hold for 20 years. She handed him the axe and the chisel without ceremony, because they had a trade and standing on formality was for people who had time for it. She wanted to get the fire going in the stove. which she had moved back to just inside the kitchen wall beneath the section of roof that was still intact, and she started making the kind of meal she had not made since she had stopped feeding ranch hands, which was a proper beef stew with dried apples in it and cornbread baked fresh. Clara, who was 4 and had no fear of strangers because she had not yet learned that she should, went and sat on the woodpile near where Grant was working and watched him with the frank curiosity of very small children. "Your name is what?" Clara asked him. "Grant Wallace," he said without pausing the chisel. "Why are you fixing our roof?" "Because your mother is trading me a meal for it." Clara considered this. "Mama is a good cook," she said finally, "but she does not let people help usually." "I noticed," Grant said. "It is because she is proud," Clara said with the devastating honesty of a 4-year-old. Grant looked at the child and then at the house and then back at his work. "There is not a thing wrong with being proud," he said. "Proud means you did not give up." Clara seemed satisfied with this and went back to watching him work. Louisa, who had been close enough to hear all of this through the open window frame, pressed her lips together and said nothing, and stirred the stew with perhaps a little more force than was strictly necessary. By the time the stew was ready, Grant had the new beam in place and was finishing the notch work on the wall plate on the east side. He had, she noticed, done it right. Not just approximately right, but actually right. The beam seated level and solid, the notches cut clean. She had watched enough carpentry when Thomas was alive to know the difference. She called him in when the food was hot, and she set a place at the kitchen table, which she had moved back inside, and she put out the stew and the cornbread and a cup of coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in, which was how she made it because that was how it ought to be made. He washed his hands at the basin outside the door without being told, which she noted. He sat down across from her children who had already started eating, and he ate the way a man ate when he was genuinely hungry, and had been for a while, steadily and without drama. He told her it was good, and she said that she knew it was, and he laughed at that, a quick, surprised sound that she had not anticipated, and it made the kitchen feel different for a moment. "Where are you headed?" she asked, because she was curious and because she figured she had earned the right to ask, having fed him. "Harlow Creek," he said. "There is a cattle operation north of town called the Double Bar that is looking for a foreman. I worked cattle most of my life down in Texas, and I am moving north." "Why north?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I have been south long enough," he said finally, which was an answer that was also not really an answer, and she recognized the kind of man who gave those because Thomas had been one too. "The Double Bar belongs to Everett Cole," she said. "He is not an easy man to work for. He is fair about wages, but he expects things done his particular way and no other." "I appreciate knowing that," Grant said. "It is just what I know," she said. "Take it for what it is worth." Henry, who had been working up his courage throughout the meal, finally asked the question that had been sitting on his face since the man arrived. "Do you have a gun?" "Henry," Louisa said. "Yes," Grant said to Henry, not unkindly. "I have a rifle and a pistol." "Have you ever shot anybody?" Henry asked. "Henry Eugene Garrison," Louisa said in the voice that had no argument in it. Grant met the boy's eyes with a seriousness that 6-year-olds responded to. "No," he said, "and I hope I never do. A gun is a tool, same as an axe. Most of the time it is for varmints and occasionally snakes. The rest of the time it stays in the holster where it belongs." Henry absorbed this with great gravity and went back to his cornbread. When the meal was finished, Grant stood and pushed his chair in and picked up his hat from where he had set it on the bench by the wall. "You will need to put a few shingles up there over the new beam before the next rain," he said. "The beam is solid, but the decking on the east side has some rot in it. You have got maybe 2-3 weeks before it matters." "I know," she said. "I will get to it." He looked at her for a moment, and she thought he might say something about the rotted decking, something helpful and well-meaning and infuriating, but he did not. "That was a fine meal," he said. "Best I have had in a while, thank you." "We are even," she said. "That is the deal." "We are even," he agreed. He picked up the chisel and the axe from where he had set them near the door and carried them to the workbench by the barn and set them down there instead of leaving them in the yard, which she also noted. He untied his horse, settled the reins, and swung up. He touched his hat to her, and then separately to the children, and rode east along her fence line toward the Harlow Creek Road. Clara watched him go and then turned to Louisa. "I liked him," she said. "He did good work," Louisa said. Which was not an agreement and was not a disagreement, and was all she was prepared to say. She did not think about him for the rest of that week. She thought about the shingles, about the east side decking, about the milk cows who needed the north pasture fence repaired, about the vegetable plot that needed planting before the last of the spring window closed. She thought about $16.43 and what it needed to stretch to cover. She thought about Henry's shoes, which were getting tight, and Clara's winter dress, which would be too small by fall. She did not think about gray eyes or a quick, surprised laugh, or the way a man had told a 4-year-old that proud means you did not give up. She went to Harlow Creek the following Thursday to sell butter and eggs at the Mercantile, and to pick up 2 boxes of staples she had ordered the week before. The town was 4 miles of muddy road, and she made it in the wagon with the old bay mare, Bessie, who was slow but reliable and did not shy at dogs. Harlow Creek in 1879 was not a large town. It had a mercantile, a saloon, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a doctor's office above the saddle maker's shop, a small church that doubled as a school on weekdays, and a land office that had been built with the optimism of men who believed the railroad was coming through and had so far been wrong about this. There was a hotel with 8 rooms, a diner run by a woman named Pearl Hutchins who made the best pie in the county and knew it, and a jail that currently housed one man who had been drunk for going on 6 days and seemed in no hurry to sober up. Louisa sold her butter and eggs to Amos Teller at the Mercantile, collected her staples, and was tying them into the wagon bed when she heard her name spoken by a voice she did not immediately recognize. She turned and found Eleanor Marsh, the minister's wife, on the boardwalk with a basket over her arm and a look of deliberate kindness on her face that made Louisa's shoulders tighten by half an inch. "Louisa, I heard about your roof," Eleanor said. "We were going to have some of the men from the church come out on Saturday. The roof is handled," Louisa said pleasantly. "Thank you for thinking of it." Eleanor blinked. "It is handled. You found someone to fix it." "I made a trade," Louisa said. "Fair exchange. It is all sorted." Eleanor opened and closed her mouth once and then appeared to reorganize whatever she had been planning to say. "Well, good. But if you ever need, I will let you know," Louisa said, which was a polite thing to say and entirely untrue, and Eleanor Marsh probably knew it, but she was too tactful to press. It was coming out of the Mercantile with the last of her boxes that she saw Grant Wallace for the second time. He was across the street at the livery stable, in conversation with a broad-shouldered man in a canvas vest who had the look of a ranch owner, which, she would later learn, was exactly what he was. Everett Cole was in his late 40s, sunburned and square-jawed, with the manner of a man accustomed to having his own way and not particularly aware that this was a manner at all. He was talking, and Grant was listening with that particular stillness she had noticed when he was working, the kind of stillness that came from someone who actually heard what was being said before they decided what to think about it. Grant noticed her before Cole did. Something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight focusing, the way a man's expression changes when something in his field of vision becomes specifically relevant rather than generally observed. He nodded once in her direction. She nodded back, because it was the thing you did, and loaded the last box into the wagon. She had driven perhaps 20 yards down the main street when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her and then Cole's voice, addressed to someone still at the livery. "Wallace, think about my offer. Good foremen do not grow on fence posts." She did not look back to see Grant's response. She told herself, driving home along the muddy road with Bessie plodding sensibly through the ruts, that she had no particular interest in whether Grant Wallace took Everett Cole's offer or moved on further north, or rode back to Texas, or fell into the Cimarron River. He had fixed her beam. She had fed him. That was the complete and total extent of their connection, and a tidy and businesslike connection it had been. She believed this completely for about 2 weeks, right up until the moment he showed up at her fence gate again. It was early May now, and the Kansas spring had turned warm and generous, the prairie grass coming in thick and green, the cottonwoods along the creek bottom leafing out in pale gold green. Louisa was on the ladder on the east side of the roof, nailing shingles, when she heard the horse. She had gotten up there on her second attempt, the first having been interrupted by Clara falling down in the yard and requiring comfort, and she was not going to come down for anything short of a genuine emergency. She looked over her shoulder from the top of the ladder and saw Grant Wallace at the gate, sitting his horse with the patient attitude of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. "Mrs. Garrison," he said. "Mr. Wallace," she said, and went back to the shingle she was nailing. A pause. "You are about 4 inches too far left on that last one," he said. She stopped with the hammer raised. "I beg your pardon. The shingle you just laid. If you want it to overlap proper with the next row, you need to move it right about 4 inches. Otherwise you will get water running under the seam." She looked at the shingle. She looked at the row below it. She hated with the full force of her considerable personality that he was correct. She moved the shingle 4 inches to the right and nailed it. "What brings you back this way?" she called down. "I took the foreman position at the double bar," he said. "The north road to the ranch runs past your fence. I will be coming by fairly regular." She did not know what to do with this information, so she nailed another shingle. "Cole treating you fairly?" she asked. "So far," he said. "You were right that he has his particular way of doing things. Most men do. Most people do," he said, which surprised her slightly. She came down the ladder eventually because she had finished the east section and needed to move it to the west, and she was not going to be foolish about it. Grant was off his horse by then, standing on the other side of the fence with his hat in his hand, which was a gesture she had not expected. "I wanted to bring something by," he said. He went to his saddlebag and came back with a paper-wrapped parcel. "I went to Amos Teller's on Tuesday, and he had a new shipment of cedar shingles in, proper split cedar, better than what you have up there now. I got a bundle." She looked at the parcel. She looked at him. The pride rose in her chest like a tide. "What do I owe you for them?" she said before she could stop herself. He looked momentarily surprised, and then the surprise settled into something quieter. "I figured maybe you had some butter to spare," he said. "I have been eating at the ranch cook's table, and the man cannot make butter worth speaking of." She studied him. "How much butter?" she said. "However much you think is fair," he said. She stood there for a long moment in the warm May sunshine, holding the fence rail with one hand, and she looked at the cedar shingles in his hands, and she thought about the rotted decking on the west side, and how she had been telling herself she would find a way to deal with it, and how the money was not there, and the time was barely there, and she was so tired, so endlessly tired, in the way that she could not afford to be because there was no one to hand the tired to. "Half a pound of butter," she said. "Made fresh this week, and a dozen eggs." "That is more than fair," he said, which is what he had said before, and she wondered if he noticed. "Leave the shingles by the barn," she said. "I will get your butter." She went inside and wrapped the butter in waxed cloth and counted out the eggs carefully into a clean cloth, and when she brought them out he was standing where he said he would be, beside the barn, looking at the fence along the north pasture in a way that told her he was noticing things she would rather he not notice. "The fourth post from the left needs setting," he said. "I know," she said. "I am getting to it." She handed him the butter and the eggs, and he held them with the same careful, competent grip he had used on every physical thing she had seen him handle, which was to say that he was the kind of man who was careful with things given to him. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the May wind moved through the young grass and carried with it the smell of the creek and something faintly like wildflowers. "I am sorry about your husband," he said, which was not something she had expected him to say, and which hit her somewhere behind the sternum in a way she had not been prepared for. "Thank you," she said, which was not what she meant, but what she meant would have taken longer to say and would have required a vulnerability she was not ready to offer. He nodded once. He went back to his horse and mounted and touched his hat, and he rode north along the fence line toward the double bar. She stood and watched him go and told herself she was only watching to make sure he did not fall through the soft patch in the road near the creek crossing. The spring turned into summer, and something slow and specific began to happen between Louisa Garrison and Grant Wallace that neither of them named. Because to name a thing is to make it real in a way that requires you to decide what to do about it, and neither of them was in a position to make that kind of decision easily. He came by the homestead perhaps once a week, always with what appeared to be a genuine reason, a question about the road conditions further south, a passing on of some information from town, and always with some small thing that he framed as a trade. A box of nails, in exchange for mending 2 shirts with a torn pocket, which she did because she was a competent seamstress, and it was a fair trade. A sack of flour from the double bar's supply that was going to go over before they could use it, in exchange for a jar of the apple preserves she had made from the last of the dried apples, and he had paid for those preserves, she would note, because he insisted on it. A young rooster who had been causing trouble in the double bar henhouse, in exchange for ham she had smoked herself, and which he said was the finest thing he had eaten north of San Antonio. He was always clear about the trade. He never said he was doing her a favor. He never offered sympathy or pity or any of the soft, suffocating kindness she had learned to dread. He simply arrived with something that he framed as a fair exchange and left the pride of the transaction intact. She understood gradually and then all at once what he was doing. She understood it one afternoon in late June when she was churning butter with Clara sleeping in the shade and Henry fishing in the creek, and she thought about the nails, the flour, the cedar shingles, the rooster, and she realized that Grant Wallace had never once explained what he got out of any of these trades, and that what he got, consistently, was less than what he gave. The butter was worth less than cedar shingles. The apple preserves were worth less than a sack of flour. The mended shirts, 2 shirts with torn pockets, were worth less than a box of 20-penny nails. And the ham, even the fine smoked ham, was worth approximately what a young rooster was worth, which was not nothing but was not quite the same level as what he had brought. She sat with this for a long time, and she felt the familiar tide of pride rise in her chest, but it ran up against something else this time, something she could not quite identify, which was the realization that he had not done this carelessly or thoughtlessly. He had done it with great precision, making each trade plausible enough that she would accept it, making each exchange feel balanced enough that she could walk away without debt. He had been extraordinarily careful with her pride, as if it were a thing he respected rather than a thing he needed to manage. She thought about this for 3 days. On the 4th day he came by the fence line on his way back from town, and she was in the garden. "Mr. Wallace," she said, without looking up from where she was staking the tomatoes. "Mrs. Garrison," he said. "The nails were worth more than the shirts," she said. A silence. "The shirts were a good mend," he said. "The cedar shingles were worth more than the butter and the eggs." Another silence. "Butter matters when the cook at the outfit cannot make it," he said. She stood up and turned around and looked at him over the fence. He was sitting very still on his horse, and he had the expression of a man who had been found out and was considering whether to argue about it. "I am not an object of charity," she said. "I know that," he said. "You have been subsidizing these trades." He looked at her steadily. "I have been making trades I considered fair," he said carefully. "You may have a different accounting of it. I do have a different accounting of it. Then perhaps we disagree on the value of certain items," he said. "That is not an uncommon thing in commerce." She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted inside the argument she had been building, some load-bearing beam of it, because he was looking back at her with those gray eyes that were not apologetic and not defensive and not pitying, and he was not backing down from the trade framing which she had expected him to do, and she had the strange and unsettling feeling that he genuinely believed, or was choosing to genuinely believe, that the accounting was close enough. "What do you get out of it?" she said. Honestly, a very long silence. I ride past here twice a week, he said. I see two children who are well fed and well kept and a homestead that is being held together by one woman who is not asking for anything from anyone. I get to be part of something that is working. He paused, and I get an excuse to stop. She had not expected that last part. She looked at the tomato plant in her hand and then back at him. An excuse to stop, she repeated. The road is long and the ranch is busy and the cook cannot make butter, he said, which was the same thing he had said before and was somehow completely different this time. A man needs somewhere to be, occasionally. That is not work. She thought about this. That is not what you get from the trade, she said. That is just the reason you stop. Is there a difference? He said. She thought about it more carefully and found to her frustration that she was not entirely sure. The summer in Kansas in 1879 was hot and dry and relentlessly wide, the sky going flat white at midday and then burning gold and orange at evening, the prairie grasses turning amber, the creek running lower and slower. Louisa's garden came in well, better than the year before, and she sold enough vegetables at the Thursday market in Harlow Creek to cover Henry's new shoes and a piece of cotton for Clara's winter dress. Grant came by the homestead twice a week through June and July, and the visits lengthened gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way days lengthen in spring, so slowly that you only notice it when you realize it is suddenly evening, and you have been talking for an hour about the price of cattle in Dodge City, and the politics of the railroad that kept not coming, and the particular way Prairie Lightning looked when it was 60 miles off and moving toward you. He was not a man who talked constantly. She had learned to appreciate this, because she was not a woman who needed conversation to fill silence, and the comfortable kind of quiet they developed between them was the kind she had not had since Thomas was alive, and sometimes they would just be in the same room doing their respective things, and that was enough. He told her things, in pieces, the way a careful man releases information about himself, not all at once but in installments that he seemed to decide on individually. He was from a ranch south of San Antonio. His father had owned it, and the father had died, and the ranch had gone with the debts that came after. He had been a cowhand, a trail driver, a scout for a surveying party, a ranch foreman twice before the double bar. He had never married, and when she asked him why, he was quiet for so long that she thought he was not going to answer, and then he said, "I was always somewhere that did not have anyone in it I wanted to stay for." She heard what he did not say with that, and she put it away in the careful place she kept things that were too significant to examine immediately. She told him things in return, which surprised her, because she had not told anyone much of anything for 2 years. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about the way her mother had run the farm after her father was killed in the war, about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 19 and deciding within the first 10 minutes of conversation that he was worth marrying, about the difficulty of the journey west and the first brutal winter on the homestead, and the way Thomas had believed, until the very end, that the farm would work out and that they would be comfortable by the time they were 40. Was he right? Grant asked. "I think he was getting there," she said. "He just did not have the time to finish it." "It looks like it might work out anyway," Grant said, looking across her well-kept yard, her solid house with its new roof beam and its cedar shingles, her kitchen garden vivid green against the dry prairie. "I'm not finished yet either," she said. He looked at her when she said that, and the look had something in it that was warm and specific, and that she felt in the same place behind the sternum as when he had said he was sorry about Thomas, but different, fuller somehow. "No," he said. "I know you are not." July gave way to August, and August began to dry the prairie down to gold and bronze, and the evenings came a little earlier and cooler, and something between them that had been building since the morning he fixed her roof came to a point one evening when he was sitting on the fence rail having coffee, which she had started bringing out because it seemed rude not to. And Clara climbed up beside him and fell asleep against his arm with the unself-conscious trust of a very small child who has decided someone is safe. Grant went very still when it happened. The way a man goes still when he is holding something precious and fragile, and is afraid to move in case he disturbs it. He looked at the sleeping child, and then he looked at Louisa, who was standing against the fence post with her own coffee cup, and his face had an expression on it that she had not seen before, something open and unguarded and a little bit frightened. "She does not do that with everyone," Louisa said quietly, so as not to wake Clara. "No," he said, and his voice had gone rough around the edges. Henry came out of the house to report that something was making noise in the henhouse, and Louisa went to check it and found a fox had gotten into the yard, which required her full attention for the next 10 minutes. And by the time she came back, Grant had carried the sleeping Clara inside and laid her in her bed with a gentleness that Henry later reported was the quietest he had ever seen a grown man move. Louisa stood in the doorway of the children's room and looked at Clara asleep and thought about what she was doing and what she was allowing, and whether pride and grief were the same thing after long enough, and whether the life she was living was the only version of it available. She found Grant in the yard when she came back out, his hat in his hands again in that gesture she had come to recognize as the one he made when he was about to say something that cost him something. "I would like to court you properly, Mrs. Garrison," he said, "if you are willing." She had known it was coming. She had known it for a month, probably longer. She had prepared responses, practical and measured, responses that acknowledged the complexity of her situation and the needs of her children and the irregularity of a widow entertaining a man she had only known since a roof collapsed. What came out instead was this: "You have been coming by twice a week for 3 months." "Yes," he said. "I have, and making trades that were not quite even. I was doing my best," he said, with a slight lift in his voice that was nearly apologetic and not quite. "Grant Wallace," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name and they both knew it, and the name sat in the warm evening air between them like something with weight. "What did you get out of those trades? And I do not mean the excuse to stop." He looked at her for a long time, and the Kansas evening was going pink and purple behind him, and the first stars were beginning to appear, and somewhere down in the creek bottom a nighthawk called. "I got to know you," he said simply. "That was what I got." She had been holding the fence rail again. She let go of it. "My children," she said, "they are the first thing." "I know that," he said, as if this were obvious, "and I will not stop working. This is my homestead and I will run it." "I would not ask you to stop," he said, "and I will not pretend to need saving, not from you, not from anyone." "Louisa," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and it was the same as the weight of his name in the air a moment ago, specific and careful and decided. "I am not offering to save you. I am asking if I can be here." She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had fixed her roof and brought her cedar shingles and called everything a trade, and never once explained, with any real honesty, what the trade gave him until now, and she thought about Thomas and about grief, and about the long 2 years of alone, and she thought about Clara sleeping against a stranger's arm, and about the way Grant went still and careful when it happened as if it were the most important thing. "You can be here," she said. "We will see how it goes." He exhaled, and she saw how much he had been holding, and she felt something loosen in her own chest in response. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me," she said. "It is just the next part." The courting was as honest and unhurried as everything else about Grant Wallace, which was to say it happened through regular visits and long conversations, and the gradual, serious involvement of a man in the daily life of 2 children who needed different things and gave them willingly. Henry needed someone to take his questions seriously, because Henry asked a great many questions about the mechanics of the world, how windmills worked, and why cattle moved east in winter, and what the Cheyenne people had called the creek before white settlers put it on a map and called it Garrison Creek after the homestead claim, which Henry thought was interesting and Grant thought about carefully before answering. He told Henry that the Cheyenne had their own names for things, and that those names had been there longer and that it was worth knowing both, which caused Henry to think very hard for several days. Clara needed someone who would sit still and listen to her describe, in exhaustive detail, the personalities of each of the chickens, which she had named, and the ongoing social drama of the henhouse, which she followed with the commitment of a theater critic. Grant listened to all of this with a seriousness that was not performed, which Louisa noticed, because she had spent 2 years around people who performed attentiveness without actually experiencing it. For herself, what she needed was something she had not quite admitted needing, which was someone who argued with her. Not combatively, not unkindly, but who pushed back when she said something that he disagreed with, who treated her opinion as a thing to engage with rather than a thing to accommodate. Thomas had been an accommodating man, which had been part of why she loved him, but Grant was a man who had opinions and held them and expected hers to be equally held, and the friction of that was something she had not known she missed. They disagreed about the railroad, about how long it would be before the grassland dried completely, about whether the Dodge City cattle trade was going to peak or keep growing. They agreed about most of the things that mattered, about honesty and work and the importance of keeping promises and the way that land, once you had put yourself into it, became part of what you were. She did not mean to fall in love with him. She had not intended to fall in love with anyone again, not from calculation or coldness, but from the genuine belief that she had already used the part of herself that was capable of it, that Thomas had taken it with him, and it was gone now, and she was someone who worked and raised her children and held the homestead together, and that was enough. She discovered she was wrong about this in September, when a dry lightning storm rolled across the prairie and set fire to the grass in the east pasture. She saw the smoke from the kitchen window and had the water barrel and shovels out before she had finished processing what she was seeing, and she had been fighting the fire for 20 minutes, beating it back toward the stone line of the creek bank, when Grant came over the hill from the double-bar road at a dead gallop with 2 of the ranch hands behind him. They had the fire out in another 40 minutes. It had burned perhaps 2 acres of grass and scorched the east fence badly, but had not reached the barn or the haystack. And when it was over and the 3 men were standing in the charred grass with their faces black and their shirts soaked, Louisa sat down on the ground with her water-soaked coat in her lap and was sick with relief, in a way she had not allowed herself to be while the fire was happening. Grant was beside her before she had finished sitting down, crouched in the grass, and he did not say anything, which was exactly right, and he did not touch her, which was also exactly right because she did not want to be touched at that moment. She wanted to be level again. When she was level, she looked up and found him watching her with an expression that she had never seen on any man's face directed at her, which was pure, concentrated, uncomplicated concern, with nothing in it of pity and nothing in it of condescension. Just the full attention of a person who cares very much about what has just happened to another person. "Thank you," she said, which was a word she did not use easily, and she meant it in the largest possible sense. "I saw the smoke," he said, which was all he offered, but his voice was not steady. She reached out, without entirely meaning to, and put her hand over his where it rested on the ground beside her. He turned his hand over immediately and held hers, and they stayed like that in the warm September ash for a while, and it was not a grand gesture, and there was nothing dramatic about it. But she knew. In the particular way you know something when your body understands it before your mind catches up, that she was in love with Grant Wallace. She did not say this immediately, because she was Louisa Garrison, and she did not say large things before she had thought about them from every possible angle. But she held his hand for a while in the charred grass, and she let herself be certain about it. And when she was certain, she felt something that had been coiled tightly inside her for 2 years begin, very slowly, to uncoil. The fall came on cool and clear, and the prairie turned all the shades of gold and brown that made Kansas look, at certain angles, in certain lights, like something so beautiful it was nearly painful to look at. Louisa put up the last of the garden produce, repaired the winter shutters on the house windows, laid in the firewood, and said yes to Grant Wallace when he asked her to marry him, which he did on the first Saturday in October, standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and his face as direct and undecorated as everything else about him. He did not get down on one knee, which she was grateful for, because she would have told him to get up. "I love you," he said before the question, which was the right order, "and I would like to spend the rest of my life being useful to you if you will have me." She looked at him. "Useful," she repeated. "Useful and present and completely and entirely yours," he said, and his gray eyes were steady and clear, and had in them the same quality she had seen that first morning, the quality of someone who was not going to look away. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He let out a breath. "Good," he said, and she could see the depth of what that breath released, and she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back with the same careful, competent grip that he gave to everything given to him, as if she were something he intended to take good care of. They were married in November in the Harlow Creek Church, on a cold, bright Saturday with the last of the season's light making everything sharp and gold. Eleanor Marsh cried, which Louisa had expected. Amos Teller shook Grant's hand for considerably longer than a handshake required, which Louisa had not expected, and which made her like Amos Teller more than she previously had. Henry stood very straight as the ring was placed and looked at Grant with the serious, assessing eyes of a boy who had thought carefully about what this meant, and had decided it meant something good. Clara wore her new winter dress, the cotton one Louisa had made from the piece she had bought at the mercantile, and she fell asleep in the church pew before the ceremony was half finished, which was so characteristic of Clara that it made Louisa's eyes go warm. They exchanged their vows in the plain, direct language of people who meant what they said, and Grant's voice was steady and even and only broke slightly on the word always, which was the word she chose to keep. Grant moved his things from the bunkhouse at the double bar to the homestead, which required 3 trips in the wagon, and was not a large number of trips because he was a man who had not accumulated much, having been on the move for a long time. He kept his foreman position at the double bar, which was 4 miles north and manageable on horseback, and the arrangement suited Everett Cole well enough that the man had actually said so, which Louisa gathered was not something Cole did lightly. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a hard one, as Kansas winters tended to be, but it was the first winter in 3 years that Louisa Garrison had not gone to bed calculating exactly how much wood was left, and whether it would be enough, and what she would do if it was not. It was not that Grant solved every problem. It was that the problems were now distributed between 2 competent people, and 2 competent people could hold more than one. Henry took to Grant with the directness of a boy who had been wanting a father to argue with and ask questions of and learn things from, and who had been patient about it in the way that children are patient about things they cannot control. They argued about everything, Henry and Grant, with the happy combativeness of people who enjoy disagreement because it is a form of respect, and Louisa would sit across the kitchen table from them in the evenings and feel something she had stopped expecting to feel, which was whole. Clara, for her part, had considered Grant her particular ally since the afternoon she had fallen asleep against his arm on the fence rail, and nothing that had happened since had changed her assessment. She brought him chickens to hold, which he held without complaint, and demanded that he listen to the henhouse dispatches, which he did, and introduced him to every neighbor child within 2 miles with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who has acquired a valuable asset. Spring came, and with it the planting, and Grant turned out to be a better kitchen gardener than Thomas had been, which Louisa did not say aloud but did think. He had a feeling for the soil that was different from the cattle knowledge she had expected, and he knew how to read rain coming from the west, and could tell by the color of the sky in the morning whether the day would stay clear or turn complicated. And this turned out to be useful in the way that a great many things about Grant Wallace turned out to be useful, quietly and without announcement. That summer, the the summer of 1880, Everett Cole died. Not dramatically, not from anything romantic or violent, but from the kind of heart episode that took men in their late 40s who had been working hard their whole lives and simply ran out of time. He died on a Tuesday in July, which was not a day that seemed proportionate to the size of the event. Cole had no wife and no children, and his will, which was a careful and specific document that surprised several people in Harlow Creek, left the Double Bar Ranch to Grant Wallace, along with a short letter that said, "I know a man who loves the land when I see one, and I have seen two in my life. The first one was my father. The second one is you." Grant read this letter in the kitchen at the homestead, sitting at the table where he had eaten 1,000 meals by then, and he was quiet for a long time afterward. Louisa sat across from him and let the quiet be what it needed to be because she understood grief and the complicated shape of gratitude. "He was a difficult man," Grant said eventually. "He knew you would take care of the land," Louisa said. "That was what mattered to him." Grant looked at her. "It changes things," he said. "The ranch is larger than the homestead. He stopped. "I do not want to make decisions about your land without you." "This is my homestead," she said. "It stays." "I know that," he said. "But," she said, and he looked up because she did not often signal a but. "But we could run both," she said. "The homestead and the Double Bar, they are 4 miles apart. The cattle can use the south pasture from here in winter and the north pasture from the Double Bar in summer. We would need to hire a hand or two." He looked at her as if she had said something that reorganized something for him. "You have been thinking about this," he said. "I have been thinking about it since Tuesday," she said. He smiled. The real one, the one she had come to know, was rarer and more genuine than the controlled almost smile he used with acquaintances. "All right," he said. "We run both." "Together," she said. "Together," he agreed. And that was how Garrison Wallace cattle became a thing, written in the county records at the Harlow Creek Land Office on a Thursday in August, with Amos Teller as a witness and Pearl Hutchins from the diner providing cake afterward, because she said any new business venture needed to be celebrated, and Pearl Hutchins was not wrong about things like that. The business grew carefully and without overreaching, which was how both Louisa and Grant did things. And by the fall of 1880 they had 4 ranch hands, 40 additional head of cattle, and a reputation in the county for fair dealing and reliable stock, the two things that mattered most in the cattle trade of that era. In November of 1880, Louisa told Grant that she was expecting their child. She told him at the kitchen table, which was where they told each other important things, and she watched his face do something she had not quite seen before, which was a full and uncomplicated joy, unmanaged and uncontrolled, the expression of a man who has wanted something for a long time and now has it. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, and she let him, and they stood in the kitchen of the homestead that she had held together alone for 2 years and then held together. And outside the November prairie was going brown and cold and vast, and inside it was warm and close and right. "Are you frightened?" he asked into her hair. "Not especially," she said, which was mostly true. She had done this before and she knew what it cost and she knew what it gave back. "Are you happy?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment because she wanted the answer to be accurate. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." The winter that followed was colder than the year before, and the work was harder with the ranch running at full capacity, and the homestead needing its winter maintenance and the pregnancy moving into its middle months. But Louisa was not a woman who stopped working because she was expecting. She modified what she did, and she was sensible about it, and she made Grant accept that being sensible about it was not the same as being fragile, and he accepted this, which was one of the things she most valued about him. Henry had questions about babies, which were practical and relentless and required honest answering, and Grant answered them with a combination of biological accuracy and appropriate simplification that she thought was very well managed for a man who had not been expecting to be a father until fairly recently. Clara was certain that the baby would be a girl, and that she would be called Daisy, and had begun decorating the corner of the back room accordingly. The baby arrived in June of 1881, in the heat of a Kansas summer, with the midwife from Harlow Creek in attendance and Grant in the yard, which was where the midwife had told him to be, and where he stayed with Henry, who was too old to be put off and too young to be included, sitting on the fence rail beside him and talking about horses for an hour and a half, which Henry later said was the most educational conversation he had ever had about horses, and which Grant later admitted was the longest hour and a half he had ever experienced. The baby was a boy, and Louisa held him when he was 1 minute old and looked at his angry, red, furiously alive face, and felt the particular love that is unlike any other love in its completeness. Grant came in when the midwife called him, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and Louisa handed him the baby without ceremony. He held his son with the same careful, competent grip he gave to everything, and his face had all the expression in it that he generally did not let be there. The openness and the wonder and the fear and the love, all of it together, wearing him the way weather wears a face. "Hello," he said to the baby, in a voice that was nothing like his normal voice, lower and rougher and entirely undone. "His name is Thomas James Wallace," Louisa said. "Thomas for his father's father and James for yours." Grant looked at her over the baby's head, and she could see what it cost him to hold himself together, and she was glad to have given him the name, because some things are larger than pride. Clara arrived in the doorway to report that the name Daisy was no longer available for the baby, since the baby was clearly a boy, and she was ready to discuss alternatives. Henry appeared behind her with the look of a boy who had been profoundly moved by something, and was pretending he had not been. Grant reached out with one arm, his son still in the other, and pulled Henry in against his side, and Henry allowed this with the calculated casualness of 8-year-old dignity. Clara climbed onto the bed with the enthusiasm of a child who has never met a situation she could not improve by being present in it, and the family was there together in the warm June room with the prairie outside the window and the curtains moving in the slow, hot breeze. Thomas James Wallace was, in the event, an excellent baby, noisy and demanding and specific about his preferences, all qualities he would carry into a personality that was, as Grant observed when Thomas was about 6 months old, already clearly going to be exactly like his mother. Louisa did not argue with this, because it was true, and she did not waste time arguing with things that were true. The years that followed were the years that a life accumulates on, the ones that do not each seem remarkable individually, but that together make something substantial. The cattle operation grew until it was one of the larger concerns in the county. The homestead was expanded, a new kitchen added on the south side, a proper parlor that Louisa had refused to have until she could afford to have it right, 2 more rooms at the back that Henry and Thomas would eventually share with the energetic mutual irritation of brothers. Henry grew into a tall, methodical young man with his mother's stubbornness and his father's practical intelligence, and at 14 he began working the ranch in earnest, not as a child helping but as a young man learning a trade, and Grant taught him with the same serious attention he had given to his questions when he was 6. Clara grew into a bright, confident girl who had opinions about everything and shared them without apology, which Louisa recognized as entirely her own fault and which she was entirely at peace with. At 12, Clara decided she wanted to be a school teacher, and Louisa supported this with everything she had because she believed in her children's capacity to choose what they were. Thomas was everything Grant had predicted and Louisa had known he would be, fierce and independent and deeply attached to his own opinion, and he exhausted and delighted them both in equal measure. He was followed in the autumn of 1883 by a daughter, whom Louisa named Annie and who was, from birth, as tranquil as Thomas was tumultuous, and whose arrival Henry described as a great improvement in the household atmosphere, which caused Thomas to chase him around the yard until they were both too tired to argue. There was a Thursday in the early spring of 1884, when the willows along the creek were just beginning to show their yellow-green, and the sky had the particular clear blue of the first real warm day, when Grant came to find Louisa in the kitchen garden, where she was turning soil with the fork, which she still did herself because she had never stopped doing things herself, only added someone to do them beside her. He sat on the fence rail and watched her work for a while. "Do you remember the first time I came by here?" he said. "The morning the roof came in," she said. "You told me you did not need help." "I did not," she said. "And then you offered to trade me a meal for fixing the beam." "It was a fair trade," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She kept turning soil. "I want to tell you something I did not tell you at the time," he said. She stopped and leaned on the fork and looked at him. "That first morning," he said, "I was not lost. I knew where the Harlow Creek Road was. I had ridden it the day before." She looked at him. "I had been watching the homestead from the ridge," he said straightforwardly. "I saw the roof come in. I saw you come outside. I saw you start moving things." He paused. "I could not ride past." She was silent for a moment. "So you invented being lost," she said. "I thought if I rode up and asked for directions, that was a reasonable reason to stop. And then I saw the damage and I could not just—" He stopped. "You lied to me," she said. "About where I was going," he said. "Yes." She looked at him. He was sitting on her fence rail in the warm spring morning, and he was 50% more gray at the temples than when she had first seen him, and his hat was a different one but somehow exactly as ruined, and he was waiting to see what she would do with the information he had just given her. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because you said something last night to Annie about how the people you trust are people you have been honest with," he said. "And I have carried that morning for 5 years and I wanted to put it down." Louisa looked at him for a long time, in the spring sunshine, in the kitchen garden she had built and kept and made into something, and she thought about the morning the roof had come in and the man who had arrived at her fence pretending to be lost and had fixed her beam and called everything a trade and never explained what he got. "You got to know me," she said, echoing what he had told her in the garden 4 years before. "Yes," he said. "And you got to stay," she said. "Yes," he said. "Grant Wallace," she said, with the full weight of his name in it. "Louisa," he said. She picked up the fork and went back to turning soil. "I knew," she said. He stared at her. "I suspected," she said, correcting herself. "There was something about the way you came around the bend. A man who is looking for a road is looking around. You were looking straight ahead." "And you did not say anything," he said. "You were fixing my roof," she said, "and the directions would have been true either way." She turned another fork of soil. "Besides, I was not ready to say anything about it." He was quiet for a moment and then, "You are the most complicated person I have ever known." "I know," she said, not ungraciously. He got off the fence rail and picked up the second fork that was leaning against the post, the one she kept for when the older children helped in the garden, and he started working the row beside hers. "I love you," he said, into the spring morning, to the soil and the willows, and the particular shade of blue the Kansas sky turned when it was warm. "I love you," she said back, with the same simplicity, and meant it in the largest and most specific sense, which was the only sense she had ever meant anything. They worked the row together in the comfortable quiet of people who have earned their silences, and somewhere in the house, Thomas began arguing with someone about something, and Clara's voice cut through it with calm authority, and Annie's small, tranquil voice offered an opinion that silenced both of them, which was Annie's particular gift. Henry came riding in from the north pasture at noon with a report about the fence near the creek crossing, which needed attention, and he delivered it to both of them with the easy assumption of a young man who had grown up watching his mother run things and his father stand beside her, and understood instinctively that this was how things ought to be done, jointly and with equal voice. They repaired the fence that afternoon, all of them together except Annie, who was too small and sat on a blanket in the grass nearby and supervised with great seriousness. And by evening the fence was right and the garden was turned, and the dinner Louisa made was a proper one with a beef roast and new spring vegetables, and the good bread she had learned to make from a recipe Eleanor Marsh had given her, which she had accepted because she had figured out over time that accepting a recipe was not the same as accepting charity, and Eleanor knew it too. They ate together at the table that had been Thomas Garrison's table first, and was now everyone's table, the five of them, and the conversation went in 6 directions at once the way conversations did in that house, and the lamplight made everything warm and the evening came in through the windows slow and gold. Later, after the children were settled, Grant sat on the step of the kitchen door with his coffee and Louisa sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they looked at the prairie in the last of the light, the grass going silver-gray in the dusk, the first stars appearing in the deep blue overhead. "I have been thinking," Louisa said. "About what?" he said. "That when Henry takes over the North operation in a few years, we should put the investment into improving the homestead pasture," she said. "The South Water table is better than we have been using. If we sank a proper well, we could run more head in summer." Grant thought about this. "We would need to hire another hand." "I have been looking at the numbers," she said. "We can afford one by next year if the spring market holds." He looked at her, and his expression was the one she knew best, the warm, particular, entirely specific expression he reserved for her, for the version of her that had stood at the fence 4 years ago and told a man who was allegedly lost that she did not need help and then offered a trade that cost her something. "You have everything figured out," he said. "I usually do," she said. "I just did not always have someone to figure it out with." "And now you do," he said. "Now I do," she agreed. The prairie night settled around them, full of stars and cricket sound and the distant lowing of cattle in the north pasture, and the house behind them was warm with lamplight, and the sounds of children finding their way to sleep, and the homestead that Louisa Garrison had held together alone, and then had come to hold together with someone was real and solid and entirely earned. She leaned her head against Grant's shoulder, which was something she did not do often because she had not formed the habit of leaning, and he put his arm around her with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows where he is supposed to be. The first stars were multiplying overhead, the way the Kansas sky did at night, opening up into something so vast and so full of light that it was humbling and magnificent in equal measure, and the wind off the prairie moved through the grass with the sound that had no word for it in any language she knew, the sound that was simply the land going on being itself, wide and patient and indifferent and beautiful. "I used to think," Louisa said, after a while, "that being alone was the same as being capable." "It is not," Grant said. "No," she said. "I know that now." She paused. "It turns out you can be both." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, which was a gesture she had come to love specifically because of its ordinariness, its settledness, the way it assumed they would be sitting here tomorrow, and the next day, and on into all the ordinary days that made up a life. "Yes," he said, "you can be both." They sat on the step until the night was fully dark and the stars were brilliant overhead, and then they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the homestead was quiet and full and entirely complete, in the way that things are complete when they have been built right and held right and made to last. In the years that followed, people in Harlow Creek would sometimes ask how the Wallaces had gotten started, how 2 people that particular and that capable had ended up on the same piece of Kansas ground, and Louisa would say, simply and without drama, that a man had come by to fix her roof one spring morning and they had made a trade, and that was how it had begun. She never explained what the trade had given him because she had decided, a long time ago, that some things did not need explaining. That the best trades were the ones where both people got exactly what they needed, even when neither one of them had admitted what that was at the outset. And Grant Wallace, who knew this better than anyone, never contradicted her. He simply sat across the room from her when she said it, with the gray eyes that still had that quality of directness and stillness, and he held whatever he was holding, a cup of coffee or a fence post or a small child with her mother's dark hair, with the careful, competent hands of a man who understood that what he had been given was everything, and that the trade had always, from the beginning, been entirely in his favor. The Kansas sky went on being vast above the homestead, and the prairie went on being wide, and the seasons came and turned as they always had, winter hard and spring generous and summer relentless and fall golden, and the Garrison Wallace homestead went on being exactly what it had always been, a thing that had been built and held and earned and loved. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the way of the best things, precisely the life that two people make when they find each other in the middle of a difficult world and decide, with full knowledge of what it costs, to stay.